Hello everybody, welcome to Escola SER. Escola SER is a training and for Colegio Arquitectos of Catalonia. Okay, it's a part of the college where we can you can make some masters, postgraduates, and etc. We are very proud to be here and that you welcome to Escola SER. And I think there is a very interesting master about the resilience. Lorenzo Querelli is the director of this master. Is the collaboration with the WIC, is the University of Catalonia, and I repeat, welcome to Escola SER, and I think you enjoy this interesting class. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alberto. So, yeah, welcome everybody. Yeah, follow up in English, since the master is in English, and most of the students we have here, the small group, it's coming from the different part of the world, so just follow up in English is better, since they cannot understand Spanish. So, welcome and thanks. This is a first talk, the first keynote of the master. This is a program, just few words, that has been designed a couple of years ago because of a very specific gap that we found out working on urban resilience and sustainability, which was a gap when you were looking not to the theories but to the implementation of urban resilience. So there was a lack of professional figures able to work across silos and to implement and to frame urban resilience, right, aligning it to urban sustainability. And this new figure, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation, the City Resilient Officers, actually, were trying to boost and to create this new profile, but there was not actually an educational program able to do that and to support this new demand, professional demand. So the master was created from a network, which is one of the biggest international network, which is called Urban Resilience Research Network. It now has almost 400 members in more than 50 countries. And there is all range of disciplines and experts and scholar in this network, and we've been working for almost 8 years now, and I have the pleasure to be one of the sitting in the board, coordination board of this network. And we decided to, because in this network we count with a lot of scholars which have been publishing in what is resilience, how should it be defined, how should it be framed, and there are dozens of key articles and papers on this, but there was no an educational program bridging all this knowledge. We decided to start up actually an educational program, and this is how the City Resilience Design and Management International Master Program has been designed. And we started last year, hosting more than 25 colleagues of us, which came to Barcelona, teaching every week, one of them, during 6 months. And then during the second 6 months of the academic year, the first group of scholars start to work with international partners on individual projects. And this is the second edition of the master. We grow a bit in terms of students, and we have 14 now, and have been increasing also the number of partners. And COAC is a new partner which is hosting some of our keynotes when they relate with architecture and urbanism. So without expanding more than that, today I'm very proud to have here Professor Michael Newman, which is an expert in urban sustainability overall, but with a lot of bridges to resilience and city resilience, with a focus which I would say shifted from governance to planning, touching infrastructure and other topics. Now, after I've been working in US, Texas, in University of Sydney, Australia, and South Wales University, now he's sitting as a professor of urban sustainability in Westminster University in London. So we're happy he's near now to us. And he has dozens of papers. Who among you have read some planning literature? He has some quite cited and famous paper on questioning actually the very key, some very key aspect of planning. Like the paper, does planning need a plan? So questioning governance mechanisms, planning processes, and a lot of other papers. And now he's just been almost releasing 3 new books with Routledge, exploring things in issues related to infrastructures, gender, and regional studies. But without going more in depth, I'm pleased to just open for him the ground, and he will be holding this keynote on sustainable infrastructure and urban resilience. And after his talk, we'll have a discussion and question with the audience. So thanks, Michael.
First of all, hello and welcome to your first day of classes. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. And I want to thank especially the program, the Urban Resilience Program, and Lorenzo and Yole for inviting me and arranging this. And so I've lived in Barcelona many years, on and off since the early 90s. And so it's a pleasure to be back here. I didn't sail from London like Greta Thunberg, so my footprint isn't so good, but I did refuse to lead a 3-day workshop in urban resilience in China with the University of Cambridge, so I saved a little there. But speaking of global footprints, let's look at some of the data. So this information was downloaded today. As you probably know, the observatory in Mauna Loa on top of the 4,000-meter mountain in Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean has been keeping atmospheric carbon dioxide data since 1957. So they already knew about the process of global warming for a century before that, but now we have the data. So we're at about 415 parts per million and rising 3 parts per million on average every year. And in fact, we're adding 3% more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year for the last dozen years, if not longer, even in spite of the financial crisis in the last decade. Carbon emissions have still gone up, not to mention methane. And so at this rate, you know, at an average increase of 2.5 or 3 parts per million, if it doesn't increase more, which it will, we'll be at 500 parts per million by the year 2050. Virtually everyone in here, not everyone, but most of you will be younger than I am now. And the last time carbon dioxide was that high, and in accordance with all the climate models, they expect temperatures to be 4 or 5 degrees hotter between 2050 and 2100. And the last time those two things coincided, those CO2 levels and those temperatures, the level of the sea was 60 to 80 meters more than today. So if you're thinking of moving to Barcelona, go up in the hills and have a diving board. So this is where the climate and other refugees in the first 6 months of this year alone, nearly 11 million worldwide, most of them climate refugees or from war or violence, often caused by drought, famine, and climate problems or flooding. And so this is just this year. Projections are for hundreds of millions, who knows how many, climate refugees over the next decades and generations. And it's not just CO2 or methane, greenhouse gases, but also daily pollution. There's an article a couple of years ago in The Lancet, the leading medical journal. And I don't expect you, of course, to try to read that. But basically, quote, the pollution is the largest single cause of disease and premature death in the world, accounting for greater than 16% of all disease and premature deaths. Greatest single cause. And which is not surprising if you think that since 1950, there have been 140,000 or more synthetic chemicals. And those are all toxic because we can't, other beings, ecosystems can't process them. We haven't evolved that way yet. And so, hurricanes, floods, storms, winds, they spread the toxic from their storage places, which are not safe. I've done a lot of research on this over the years in different continents, coastal areas. It's a huge issue. And these storms, as we all know, they're more frequent, more intense, more severe, more impacts. And so they spread the toxicity. And if you need more evidence, not that we need more evidence, in the United States and United Kingdom, life expectancy, longevity, for the first time since records have been kept, has been going down steadily since 2015. If that's not an indicator, nothing is. So, and moreover, according to the Lancet article that I referred to, nearly 92% of pollution-related deaths and illnesses occur in low-income and middle-income countries, and in countries of every income level, they affect the poor, the marginalized the most. The same old story. So why am I reviewing this data? You probably know it, all of it and much more. And why am I revealing my carbon footprint? You could care less, I'm sure. So, well, it's because with nearly 8 billion people in the world today and increasing by 1 billion more people every 12 or 13 years, right, we'll be at about 10 billion around 2050, just when sea levels are potentially going to be rising seriously. Then it's the our collective impact is what? It's the result of the cumulative, incremental, and cascading and non-dissipative impacts that each of us make every day with every action, every decision. And not just individuals, but corporations, organizations, governments, etc. So, and most of these impacts come from the way we use the land. And because most people live in cities, around 85% worldwide, according to a recent EU report, which is much more fine-grained in the latest data compared to the UN, which says about 60%. But that's just aggregated whatever countries give the UN. Well, the actual urbanized areas around the world are about 80-85%. And so land use, urban planning, cities, that's where the action is. That's what we have to plan to make sustainable and resilient. So, for example, India's, and if you don't mind me just reading this. So, India's and Africa's population and consumption increases will certainly prove to be a tipping point. Africa has about 1.2 billion people today, with 2.4 billion by 2050, an estimated 4 billion by 2100 if trends more or less continue. Their fertility rates are very high. Several African countries have fertility rates of over 7 for childbearing age, women. And you can see why China is investing heavily in Africa and parts of Asia in their Global Belt and Road Initiative. those are the things that are driving their decisions. And their investments projects are estimated to be over $1 trillion for foreign, meaning non-Chinese infrastructure over a 10-year period starting 2017. 1 trillion, 10 years, Africa, Asia, South America. These infrastructure investments are designed to make their economies more like advanced OECD countries with higher levels of consumption and spending. Moreover, China has followed the USA by becoming an economy fueled by debt. China's overall national debt is now risen to 300% of GDP. They're starting to creep up. America's is about 7 times GDP. About 10 years ago, they were spending cash on infrastructure in China. And these other countries where these investments will be made over time will also get into the higher consumption and the debt cycle. So you can see where this is going. Per capita consumption is increasing, population is increasing, and so the curves, all the curves of that you read about, the projections, the models, they're all going to be increasing, and then there will be tipping points where we just don't know what's going to happen. So these are the types of trends that, well, imagine the oil company giants are basing their global strategies on as well. So let's look at a bit more data. So this was from the New York Times this summer. I don't know how well you can see that, but water crises around the world according to various scientific models. And just a couple weeks ago, you've probably seen it, the IPCC released another report on oceans and the cryosphere, the ice, Antarctic, Greenland, glaciers, etc. The report that I showed earlier, the cover on land use, was released this past summer. So it has fresh data. And finally, the IPCC is recognizing what we all know, cities are the action is we have to make them sustainable and them resilient. So the IPCC is finally, the day after that prior report was released, this was in the Times of London, so the political cartoonists aren't wasting any time, but they're capturing the essential message, that this message is in a bottle floating out there, no one's listening to it, no one's reading it, yet the situation is the way it is and getting worse. So, here are the oil companies. That's in billions of US dollars just last year alone. If that weren't enough, first of all their profits have been rising double digits last year compared to the year before, and this year they're rising double digits compared to last year. And they're spending, when the analysts look at the data, over $1 trillion, and perhaps much more than that, dollars over the next years, investments for new exploration, new production. Exxon alone is spending $230 billion over the next 5 or 10 years for production and exploration. So you think we're going to get off carbon and petroleum anytime soon? I don't think so. At least the oil companies aren't think so. So under the red lines, between the red lines, the Russian, with the exception of ConocoPhillips, the Russian and the Chinese oil companies are investing the least in renewable energies. And the Europeans in general are investing the most. But it's still a very small percentage of total capital expenditures of the oil companies. So while they're making the money on fossil fuels, those of us who are complicit, including me for sure, even though I don't own a car and don't travel much as I used to, we're all being made, we're all fossil fools, right, because of fossil fuel. So what can we do? What can we do? The biggest contribution for carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide for that matter as well, methane, is, as I was mentioning earlier, from our individual actions and decisions. And their effects are incremental and cumulative, et cetera. In other words, they're here to stay for a long time. If we were to not put a single gram of CO2 or methane into the air starting today in the whole world, because of inertia and momentum, the properties of the of Gaia, you know, the atmospheric and its relation to the oceans and the land, temperatures will still rise, and global warming will be with us for centuries, according to the scientists. I'm just the messenger. I'm not a climate scientist. I work with some of the top Earth systems people and climate scientists in the last 5 or 10 years, and that's what they're saying. And you know, with this, the way it is with every report, more, faster, worse. So the point is that it's our individual actions that accumulate, that are incremental, that we tend not to think about. And so typically these kinds of complex problems bring about solutions that are political and economic. The problem nowadays is politics. Not only is it toxic, there's virtually no real progress. There is some, but not much. And so, in my view, then the solutions are more economic than political, and require a total change in our economies and societies. We know that, but most people still live the way that they have in the past or their parents. There's a lot of sunk costs, sunk capital, fixed structures and infrastructures that make it hard to leave because of the nature of the way we've planned, built, and designed our settlements over the centuries, over the millennia. And so solutions that affect our individual wallets and our governments and corporations' bottom lines, those are the economic solutions. And yet, you may be familiar with an American writer from over a century ago named Sinclair Lewis. And he wrote a book, many books, but he wrote a book called The Jungle about the slaughterhouses, you know, for the meat in Chicago. And a book came out in 1906, and it led to some major reforms. And but he had this often repeated line about resistance to change, even though, as it turned out, his book was a sensation back then and led to immediate and multiple national legislation about health and safety and labor. But he wrote this: "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends him on not understanding it," right? So I guess you're thinking about the oil companies right now, and others perhaps. So let's bring this back to the title of my talk, Sustainable Infrastructure and Urban Resilience. So let me start by briefly stating that I see that there's a three-part equation to sustainability and resilience. And the first part is the first part is a sustainable economy, sustainable societies. The second part is we want a sustainable economy, if we want to live sustainably in our societies, we need sustainable cities. Not only is it where most of the people live, but even a disproportionate amount of economic production and CO2 and pollution production, even greater per capita than not in urban areas. And in fact, when you look at the data, as the world's been increasingly urbanizing, we're increasingly less sustainable, which is why I wrote over 20 years ago, but it was so controversial and got published about 15 years ago, an article titled The Compact City Fallacy. You know, the dogma in urban planning, urban design, and other professions is the more compact a city is, the more sustainable it is. Simply ain't true. Simply isn't true. And all the data show it. But it's been dogma for ever since the sustainability people, including me, and so the third part of the equation is when you look at the data, as Lorenzo mentioned, I've been focusing on infrastructure since my first year-long sabbatical here in Barcelona in the middle of the last decade. And while I had done some work on infrastructure before, all the data show that infrastructure accounts, depending on the place and the state of the economy and other factors, anywhere from 80 to 90% of all emissions, all pollution, all energy consumption, everything flows through infrastructure. We know that, but if we want to make cities sustainable and therefore economies sustainable, we absolutely must have sustainable infrastructure. So that's my three-part equation, so to speak, for getting to sustainability. So, okay, how do we get sustainable infrastructure? Well, if business as usual, in other words, the world as it is today, is not very sustainable. Barcelona is a good exception to that, by the way. It could be amongst the most, if not the most, sustainable city of its size around, and they've been doing a lot of that through the infrastructure. But we still need to go a lot further. And so, but there's a bit of a problem to overcome first when we're dealing with infrastructure. When it comes to infrastructure, most people's eyes glaze over, they tune out, it's boring, it's too complicated, it's too technical, it's cost too much, we have no control, and it's too big to deal with, right? So, is this a problem that's too big to solve? Well, I disagree. And what I hope to lay out over the next few minutes for the rest of my talk is how we can and need to, in my view, change the model of how we plan, design, and build and operate infrastructure radically to have more sustainable cities and economies. So I think that infrastructure is really simple in a way, particularly when you look at it from a perspective of the public. And people just want it to work. Most people don't even think about it unless it doesn't work, right? And so what will keep infrastructure working in the face of neoliberalism and austerity? Not to mention the climate crises and disasters from forest fires and storms and floods and et cetera, and refugees. So again, is this a problem too far? Is it beyond us to solve? I think the solution stems, like all good solutions do, from dealing with the causes at their source. And if the cumulative and incremental impacts of individuals, and by individuals I also mean individual corporations, governments, organizations, what have you, not just individual people, then the solutions must address these individual impacts. In other words, all the impacts. And the choices and decisions that lead to them. And by individuals, I mean us. And so we're all complicit and we all have to change. But one way to do that that's very effective, that's very strategic, that it's a big lever that affects everything else, is infrastructure. I mean, just think about it. Without infrastructure, cities couldn't even exist, period, right? So if we want them to be sustainable, the infrastructure has to be sustainable. And so this is where infrastructure comes in. Why? Because the way we've built infrastructure to date is the main part of our problem. We have built centralized, large-scale infrastructure systems that absolve the individual of thinking and responsibility. It's not just that the systems themselves aren't sustainable, but it's the way they co-opt us and make us complicit. It's something that Martin Heidegger wrote in the 1950s in his very famous essay that's worth reading about. It's titled "The Question Concerning Technology." But it's not technologies we think of today. His technologies were institutions and how humans get corrupted. So I'll write that down for your future reference. Heidegger. Concerning technology. So I think that's the fundamental problem, and it points to a fundamental solution, but that fundamental solution is radically different than today. So we use infrastructure nowadays without thinking about it and including their consequences, their impacts. We all expect electric power when we flip the switch. We always expect the water to come when we turn the faucet or flush the toilet. We get in the car, the bus, the train, the plane, and we expect to get to our destinations, although that's a bit more problematic nowadays. And yet large-scale centralized systems make all this happen. They also have large-scale impacts and costs. So if infrastructure is a main component of the problem, up to 80 to 90%, as I suggest, because it conditions the way we consume and we move around, etc., then radically changing our infrastructure must be a part of the solution. So we need infrastructure that's distributed and modular and networked, not centralized and fixed, right? And we need infrastructure that's it's not large scale, that's not expensive, that's not rigid, that's not fixed, and not obsolete in the face of the climate crisis or even underwater. Instead, infrastructure that is small scale, inexpensive, modular, mobile, flexible, and lasting, that allows for incremental adaptation to change, including climate change, making it more resilient in the face of disasters and other, for example, refugees and climate change. So our parents' and grandparents' infrastructure doesn't serve us sustainably nowadays, if it ever has. So this applies to structures as well as infrastructures. Let me explain. And it also shows their relations between structures and infrastructures. For example, I ask my students, why does a building have to consume energy? I ask my clients as well. Why can't a building produce its own energy? Why does a building have to consume water? Why can't it collect its own water, recycle its own waste, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And we rely on expensive, centralized, and polluting infrastructure systems to take care of all these now. Buildings should take care of themselves. They should be more like trees that contribute rather than sinks that consume. Designing them this way will significantly decrease their reliance on expensive centralized systems as well. If you take buildings in general, any kind of building off the grid or off the multiple grids, then you have less reliance on the grid. So let me show you a bit of what I mean. So for example, helical turbines, which have the advantage of needing about half the wind speed of a typical rotary three-bladed turbine, can also be very small and very inexpensive. They're down to about €1,000, the cheapest helical turbines that will power a single-family house. They could go on any roof, whether it's in a single house or there's some in Sydney, one of the, I think it's about 40 or 50 story skyscrapers has a very big helical turbine. So they're very, they don't have the impacts in terms of some of the impacts that are perceived by opponents to helical turbines. Another example is thin film photovoltaics, and I also know that, for example, the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where I was a professor of sustainable urbanism for a number of years, they were the co-inventors of the solar panel. Well, one of my colleagues there, this is about 10 years ago now, devised an organic thin film solar panel. And the advantage to thin film solar panels is that you can put them anywhere. Nowadays they have very small ones. I was thinking of putting an image on it where a small one you can roll up and stick in your pocket or whatever to recharge a small handheld device. And imagine what it would be like when there's organic thin film solar panels, because solar panels are very complex composites of materials that can't be recycled. So what happens when they all get to their 25, 30-year life cycle? Where do they go? The same place that nuclear power plants go when they reach their 25, 30, 35-year life cycle. So, and I want to talk very briefly about the relationship between structures and infrastructures, and this is actually the perfect place for it, because over a century and a half ago, Ildefons Cerdà, the engineer who planned the expansion, the Ensanche, l'Eixample de Barcelona, outside the old city walls, he designed and planned Barcelona where the city blocks were completely integrated with the infrastructure, not just roads. He also designed stormwater systems, water supply, sewage systems, and even he designed, but it wasn't built, an underground railway, a metro. That's one of the things that he designed that didn't get built. And but the real genius of the plan, in my opinion, is that the way he integrated the roads and the infrastructure with the residential and commercial blocks is worth exploring. There's a lot of information on that here in Barcelona. And I think it's time to update that relation between the infrastructure and structures generally, and even beyond the superillas that are, the supermanzanas, the superblocks that are being retrofitted in a few places around Barcelona now. In fact, Barcelona architect Miguel Roldan and myself wrote a chapter in a book titled Generació Barcelona in 2011, and the nominal editor-author of that book was Xavier Trias. And our chapter was titled in Catalan, No relat per a l'habitatge públic com a infraestructura cívica, or a new story for public housing as civic infrastructure. We wrote about converting Barcelona city blocks, illes, or islands, in Cerdà's language, into renewed civic infrastructure where each block not only generates its own energy and collects its own water and recycles its own waste, but has a green public space in the center of the block, as Cerdà planned. Community gardens, rainwater collection, waste recycling, solar panels, wind turbines, community spaces, more fully usable rooftops, and so on. So they're productive and self-reliant rather than consumptive. And I think that Cerdà's original design enables that type of retrofitting. It'll take time, it'll cost money, but the benefits will far outweigh the costs. And so, speaking of resilient structures, I want to use this photograph as an example. The photograph is from the year 1900, and it's from the Central Plains of the United States. And the photograph's by Edward Curtis. And it captures a Blackfeet Indian tribe, their settlement, their teepees. And And the interesting thing about the Blackfeet and other tribes in the center of the United States, fully the middle third of the continent or more, the Mississippi and Missouri River basin that drains most of the country, the Great Plains it's called. It was a savanna, a grassland, before the colonists. Well, these Indians were not nomads by nature. It wasn't their cultural, their social nature to be nomads like some nomadic tribes or peoples, cultures were around the world for millennia. They were nomads because of nature. Why? Because the Mississippi River and the Missouri River, it can flood up to 100 miles, 160 kilometers on either side of its banks. In fact, one flood of that size happened in '94 when I was living here in Barcelona. They happen more and more frequently. So what did they do? They packed their entire settlements worth of teepees on their animals' backs and they moved. And they just resettled somewhere else out of harm's way. And then they went back to the rich valley where they cultivated their crops, right? That was replenished every year by the flooding. Since 1857, a big Mississippi, Missouri flood, the wisdom of the Army Corps of Engineers, and I use that word ironically, has been channeling their dikes, levees on either side of the Mississippi River, and they're taller and longer than the Great Wall of China, right? And so it's this infrastructure, the centralized, large-scale, expensive infrastructure is very unsustainable because it caused people to live near the river in harm's way instead of intelligent, common sense, connected to nature like the Indians. So, but I'm not suggesting that we go back to the teepees or the caves. It's not going to happen. But what I'm suggesting is that the principle is what can be adapted today. This is resilience. Nowadays, we use sandbags to try to protect the settlements from the river floods. That's not resilience. So I think that principle, they're modular, they're small, they're mobile, they're sustainable, and they're connected to the land. And I think green infrastructure or biomimic infrastructure is another aspect of infrastructure that I could have added to that list, comparing the old style of infrastructure with the ones we need in the future. And so the Indians didn't get flooded out, but we do. And in the future, entire metropolises, it looks like maybe in your lifetime, maybe not, hopefully not. But when you look at all the data and the oil companies' investments and profits and et cetera, and all the population growth and per capita consumption increases, I think the trends are pretty clear. So in conclusion, infrastructure in cities that they serve must change rapidly and massively. No longer can they be the infrastructure of our grandparents. No longer can they be fixed in place, centralized, and too big to fail. Too big to fail is a very unfortunate euphemism for throwing unconscionable sums of money away on systems that are unsustainable. These same old systems keep us set in our ways and set in our cities that are both soon to disappear forever, at least as we know them now. Thus, we must design cities and infrastructure in a totally new way and retrofit existing ones so we can make them resilient and able to adapt rapidly to rapidly changing climate futures. Our futures depend on it. Thank you very much.
I'd like to share with you just two points. could be seen like critical reflection of what Michael just said, since for the general public, but also for the staff, for the students, will be two main golden line that we will be exploring through the master. And one is regarding the principle of resilience, which are the principles, and the second one is the definition of adaptation. When you show the slides about the principle of decentralized infrastructure and a decentralized one, so rigid and flexible, and so that to me brought to light one of the reasons of the master to be here, which highlights the gap, the existing gap and the paradox of all the resilience discourses and policy discourses and the use of resilience as a metaphor. You know, the resilience definitions, broadly speaking, is being adaptable. So any system which is resilient is a system which can adapt challenges and stresses. And all the political discourses about the resilient city is a city being adaptable and accepting change, etc., etc. Then, when you start to look to implementations, researches, and very practical example, there is a big gap, whether it is being adaptable, being flexible, metaphor of resilience is translated through very centralized, top-down, big infrastructures, fixing and lowering the exposure to threats. So you have a big risk of being flooded, and you build a more resilient city by building a big dam, and you protect your city and you're more resilient, right? And why this happened, and this brought me to the second example you mean. Because there is a lot of exploration in the academia, in the theory, about the definitions and framing of adaptation, this meaning of being resilient. But then there's really low consistency when you go to the implementation. And that lies a very key example. Because, for example, there are very specific principles for defining whether a building or an infrastructure is or not more resilient than another. And so a big infrastructure is not more resilient than a modular or decentralized one for all kind of small measurements of the resilience of that infrastructure. A modular and flexible and adaptable infrastructure more resilient because if it is broken, then you can change just one piece if it is modular, right? If it is decentralized, then the probability to collapse is lower. So in a way, there are all kind of measurement and principles that conferring resilience to an infrastructure or a subsystem or your system under analysis. However, when you look to the way resilience is implemented, some way there is a big discourse about the need of building more adaptive cities. And then at the end, there is the big investment in the big infrastructures, centralized, which want to just prevent on lowering the risk or the exposure of our assets and people, of course. No? And why this happened? This is something that we explore deeply in the master. I think that when you start looking to resilience principles, okay, the one that Michael cited in the slide, then most of the literature come from the social ecological system thinking. So the fathers of resilience are ecologists, having looked and studied ecosystems, and they, from quite a hard science perspective, look into the ecosystem and ecosystem dynamic and regime shifts and collapse and renewal in ecosystem. They find out a lot of characteristics of the more resilient ecosystem, and therefore there is an incredible amount of literature on which are these principles that confer resilience to a system. And unfortunately, we as planner, as the policymakers, the consultant having drafted the first definition and frame of urban resilience, simply took those principles from social ecological management perspective and brought them to cities. And so if an ecosystem is resilient, whether it's redundant and whether it's diverse, etc., then they say that the same can be applied to the city. And unfortunately, I'm not going into detail now, but there is all range of criticism around this gap between social ecological perspective, how nature and the social ecological system works, and how cities work. And for example, in infrastructure, you can see that adaptation and be adaptive means build a big dike and protect us from flooding, or be adaptive and adapting by moving away, or through some kind of very distributed and decentralized infrastructure, or through radically transformation. And just doing like in the Netherlands, the people are starting investing in floating houses. There's no way of getting protected from something which stress and threat is constantly increasing and increasing and increasing. There's no way you can cope with that with dikes. And within the climate scenario, you have floodings and storms happening more frequently, and the level of expected impact is growing. So the flooding that was conceived like once in 100 years, in 20 years, it's going to happen every 5 years. Or what's already happened, I guess it was in Taiwan, that a 100-year return period flooding happens twice in 3 days. And so whether, even if you design your city for protecting your city for a 100 return period flooding, then the day after you won't expect and you won't be ready for another one, right? This is the kind of change that we're going to face. So the reflection that we will be doing, but I guess everybody should be doing, is how to cope with this high extreme uncertainty about what will happen. Therefore, you cannot plan in advance to protect your system. You need to adapt yourself just to be able to, if it is necessary, fail because you're flooded, but in a safe way. Do not organize your system the way that you collapse because you couldn't cope with that. Find mechanisms to constantly cope with anything that could be happening. And the best way of doing it is not through big central infrastructure, because of a list, I guess, of characteristics of communication, of spatial and temporal scales embedded in the management of a big infrastructure respect to decentralized one, the management of the responsibility that people has in dealing with the small-scale infrastructure that you don't have if you have big infrastructure, right? So there is, I don't want to take too much time. It was just a reflection, sharing with you and opening the floor for questions. But there were to me these two critical messages about what is adaptation does and how we do adapt through infrastructure and how we should slowly move through a new meaning of adaptation, which is a bit what I get from the closing remark. And the second, which is more an open-ended question, is how we measure, how we assess, how we guide this new kind of adaptation, through which principles, right? In infrastructure, maybe you have few design criteria and principles, but you will see through the master that it's still a very muddy, soil, exploring which are the principles for urban resilience, how you measure them. It's not the same building redundancy in an infrastructure if a big company increase the redundancy of its own network, or if you disrupt this network and just split and decentralize this network in many small networks. Two phases of redundancy imply totally different socioeconomic patterns of development for the city, and a completely different behave for the citizen in the way you live in the city and you relate yourself with the infrastructure. So this was my main reflection on the messages of Michael, which to me opened really the floor for lots of a discussion, because it's go from exactly. So I would invite you to have some feedback or question for Michael. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your class. I wanted to. We've been given a lot of new material to read, and it's very exciting. And I wanted to have the opportunity to push you into a discussion related to this also. One of them, which has to do with the power of linkages as planning and how they create institutions. Because my understanding, or at least my perception, I wouldn't go as far as understanding, but my perception is that we do have these mega infrastructures, very centralized, and so on, that are crystallized within the cities, following a very effective image from the post-war era and the 60s in the case of the rest of the world, that has the Corbusier metaphor of the city as a machine and has to be very, very efficient. And also it was equated with the dream of modernity. So we have all these engineers who work and continue to work because they were trained that way, based on that image that produced what we have today. So the following step was then all of the institutional and organizational architecture around that was prepared to make sure that that was consolidated, and they were very, very effective. So now, beyond the discussion about political economy and this interest and so on, which definitely would be our main, since we are going to be discussing urban planning and not the future of the oil companies itself, I would leave that aside. And then leaving aside the ontology about whether the main definitions and characteristics of the cities are coming from a different society, let's say that you do have a mayor that is convinced. He still has to go through a budgeting cycle that is based on the efficient machine inventory that was done in the 60s. So his margin for introducing innovation, or his margin for maneuver, is very, very small. His organization is all based on the
I think I know where you're going with this.
So, the point here is, how do you, there's a lifespan, right? How long does it mean that we need to wait for that image that was so effective to fade away and then have that topple down that, or do we have any hope in actual chaos and informality of the
Right. Did you ever see that in I think it was actually in 1984, there's a famous American television commercial during the halftime of the Super Bowl, and which is the biggest television event in the United States. And there was a huge auditorium of white men in dark suits, and there was this big image on the screen, and some radical wearing colorful clothes ran into the auditorium with a hammer and smashed the image on the screen. It was an advertisement for Apple, for Macs, the computer, the first Mac computer, and the advertisement caused a sensation. Well, IBM, which dominated computers back then, now isn't in computers at all. And Apple's one of the biggest, I think it's by equity value, the biggest company in the world. And what they did was so smart, not only from advertising, but from their products and services. I'm not advocating Mac, I'm just using it as an example. And so basically what they did was they smashed the old image. There's a lot of ways to overturn an image. Revolution is one, just creating a new option. How do you get people out of cars? You have to give them an option. People want to move around. So, and all the images at all the institutions, whether it be the finance and budgeting aspects of the institution or the design or public works or the, every aspect of all the institutions was geared towards efficiency, modernity, and profit. That's a very powerful image. Bigger is better was the old motto. And then came a book in the late 60s, early 70s called Small is Beautiful, and et cetera. And so we're living in transition times. The problem is, how long is that transition? How much time do we have? That's the new question, And I loved being in academic settings because of the young people. But anyway, the answer to your question is, I've written a book about planning in Madrid that deals with large-scale infrastructures and how images are used to form and perpetuate institutions. But there's a diagram about life cycle of institutions and images, and they're related. If you want to change an institution, you change the image. But institutions are embedded in society, so you have to change people in society, their image. And so, but it's not as hard as it looks, because how do we change people? How does a person, matter of fact, the cognitive scientists have figured this out. How does one individual, how do we change our mind about something? We change the image we have in it about that thing from one to another, from one image to another. We're cognitive thinkers. Yeah, a lot of people learn in, orally, through experience, through tactily, but mentally, there's two basic schools and they're not opposing, they're just complementary. Most decisions are intuitive or common sense, right? Thinking Fast and Slow, the Kahneman's book that won him the Nobel, he won the Nobel Prize before, but so we just rationalize decisions ex post facto with our mind, but we make decisions mostly with our heart or our intuition or feeling. But when we do use our mind, when we change our mind about something, we change our image of it. So it's a little different, right? And so that's how. And we have to create new images. And so that's why I showed some, they're around today. I could have shown more examples of modular infrastructure, but I think, the new image is contained in the right-hand column of that list I showed that Lorenzo was referring to. Does that answer your question a little bit? It's a good question. It's tough, but we have to do it, and that's how.
Your presentation, which was very broad in the sense of how many topics you touch upon. I lacked the growth imperative idea. I don't know about this. Because you mentioned our decisions day by day and the corporations and governments, etc., are the costs of many climate change or climate emergency. How about the growth imperative? How deep is this into our society, and how do we?
You know the answer to that question.
So then maybe I would do a follow-up question. How do we think about, I would use a more radical word, degrowth infrastructure within our...
Right. It's a funny word. In fact, I chaired a conference, international conference track on, the French insisted on calling it degrowth, which in English doesn't make much sense. But regardless of the terminology, we have to redefine progress. Progress has meant growth, and we have to redefine it. In fact, there was a phenomenal, it doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. There's a phenomenal nonprofit organization, an NGO, based in San Francisco for several decades. You might know of it, Redefining Progress. Unfortunately, their offices and their website is closed down, but which is a sign of how deeply embedded progress and growth are, but I think that that could be a harder challenge to challenge that. We could do it as individuals, but I think that if we're going to grow, and we are growing. Populations are growing. And everyone wants what, excuse me for putting it this way, what we have, meaning in the wealthy countries. Everybody wants it because they see it every day on their phones, their screens, And so, fair enough. So we have to do things that are sustainable, really sustainable, and that means changing the economic paradigm. So I was just using, oil companies as an example because they're not the only, the oil companies wouldn't produce oil if we didn't use it, right? So yes, did you have any other questions? Yes.
Don't know how much time we have, and we know that the society that we have now is not going to change, actually. I mean, not soon. We see the example that you told before, the municipality of Barcelona doesn't understand how much time do you need to plan something like that and organize everything in 4 days, 2 hours per day. What do you want to, what do you obtain from 2 hours per day for 4 days? You don't have any plan after that. So I think there is a lack of knowledge and interest in the actual politics generation. So I'm worried about how much time it takes because there should be a change of generation, and then we start to talk about that.
And run for office. It's not a joke. Run for office. Run for office. When you finish this program, run for office. 5 years from now, I'd like to hear from all of you who's run for office and who's in. I'm not joking. Who's changing Congress in the United States? 20-somethings and 30-somethings. Mostly women, mostly people of color, for example.
I'm here for that.
Run for office or start a company, start a nonprofit. Change the company that period.
And that, what do you call about all the being resilient? I think it's really easy with new stuff. I'm from Italy, and Italy is a problem. Apart from everything is old, mind, everything, the approach, everything is old. But the main problem is that adapting Italy, is different from adapting the Netherlands. I lived 1 year in the Netherlands, and you had bike path everywhere because the streets are double size with respect to Italy. Italy, it's a challenge, I think. So I think that what should be changed is also is not the approach of making something new, but learn how to adapt to what we have. And I think that also, like you said, we should start, for example, with buildings now. While a building should be able to produce its own energy and stuff. And at the same time, we should ask for something that is cheaper, like a building that is cheaper, infrastructure that are cheaper. But I think it's hard to combine these two stuff. The example of photovoltaics, amazing. In a while, we will reach this point with organic stuff. But till now, I think that we really like part is that.
I hear what you're saying. Ho stato tanto tempo a Italia, so I'm somewhat familiar with. And in fact, we have besides Lorenzo, who is Italian, as are some others here, we have a professor, the former dean of the architecture school here, Antonio Font, who has done a lot of work in Italy and France as well. I like to recognize him in the back. He's contributing a chapter to one of the books that Lorenzo mentioned on regional design. Your commentary is very powerful and very appropriate. And so I think that, for example, in the Netherlands, they've been building dikes forever, but those dikes will never be high enough to deal with what's coming. And in fact, many cities are doing the same. London is investing billions more in water flood defenses along the Thames, and New York City is going to be doing the same. But what I say is, given what's going to be happening, they're temporary band-aids. But the thing is, because they're so big and so fixed and so centralized, they'll draw a lot of money and a lot of resource and a lot of attention away from what'll really get us out of this situation. And so, those walls will go the same way as city walls in Europe, 200 or so years ago. They're all gone. Everything is becoming more open. In nature, there are walls, mountains and cliffs, but nature, through wind and water and movement of species, overcomes barriers, and societies and individuals are becoming more open. So I think that's another thing we could have added to the list: more porosity, more openness. I think that the solution, besides being incremental and all those things we've been talking about, is that cities need to become more like nature, because in nature, what humans call waste doesn't exist. It's all circular. It all gets reused. There's no waste and pollution in nature. There are some toxics from certain animals and certain plant species, but they're just for self-defense. But in terms of the kinds of toxins and waste that humans produce, it's not comparable. And so we need to make cities that are circular. I know you know about the circular economy. Well, we need circular cities. And in Finland, they're doing some very interesting work there, elsewhere as well. But I think Estonia and Finland are amongst the most interesting in that regard. And in nature has its own infrastructure, and they're all open and interconnected and integrated. And I think that's the message. If we're going to have cities and infrastructures there that are going to be resilient, this infrastructures and structures need to be integrated in sustainable ways. And integration goes against everything in I don't know your name, the first woman who asked the question about modernity and the image, right? So integration goes against a lot of what the modern project, meaning since Descartes, not just since Mies van der Rohe or the 20th century modernism, stylistic modernism, but modernism in a way of human thinking, of very narrow, very rational, very linear. It's easy to criticize. There's been a lot of benefits to, and it's part of human nature, linear thinking, rational thinking. But it typically goes against integration. Integration is hard. And so, but ecosystems have had the benefit of hundreds of millions, if not billions of years of evolution. And it's the intelligence of evolution that enables those ecosystems and the species within it to be sustainable, resilient. Adaptation is the DNA of the intelligence of evolution. How can we design buildings that learn? Can we design cities that learn? Can we design infrastructures that learn? Right? The answer is we have to, because we haven't been. All those levees along the Mississippi, or all those dikes or levees in the Netherlands, etc. I don't know if any of you have been to Jakarta, but that city won't be here much longer, and it's 30 million people. In fact, they just voted to move the capital well inland. Great, you still have 30 million people in Jakarta. What's going to happen? And it's not just Jakarta. There's I don't know, one could do the calculations, but there's hundreds of millions of people in China alone living within 20, 30 meters of the coast. One country, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, European cities, all over the world. So so I think the challenge that all your questions and comments are saying indicate that the change has to be radical, but of a certain way, different principles, different approaches.
When you talk about decentralizing systems, I think there has to be a discussion about power relations again.
Mm-hmm.
And then I disagree with the idea that if you talk about the future of cities, you can avoid talking about the oil companies, for example. That's unavoidable. You need to talk about those two together. Or you see that happening in a kind of a, cartoon democracy that we have nowadays?
Yeah, well, decentralization, if you think about a typical organizational hierarchy, it's decentralized. But typically the power is retained by the top of the hierarchy. Distributed networks a little different. The nodes are important because they're gateways that control flows, right? And in nature, there's lots of flows and lots of conduits for those flows, but there's also just flows that are indiscriminate of conduits. Rivers overflow banks, you have the oceans, you have wind. And so I think that in terms of the way humans think, in terms of, like, for example, these are images, right? Distributed is more appropriate than decentralized, but it's partly an issue of semantics, but more importantly an issue of principles, because in decentralization, a centralized power or authority can control equally effectively. For example, I was an officer in the Navy. I mean, the military is very decentralized, and it has to be for operational purposes, but there's centralized command and control. So I think it's an important distinction to keep in mind anyway. But I think your main point was about power, and there's no question that that's why I mentioned a Sinclair Lewis quotation. It happened to be about money, which is all about power. Corporations have the politicians in many Western democracies in their back pocket because they pay for the campaigns and the election campaigns. And so, but in any case, there was a question in the back. Yes?
Yeah. So I have sort of questions and comments that I have experienced in my background from life. That in the poor nations or the poor cities, one of the biggest problems is the decision-making problem, prioritization of the projects.
Let's say that again. The what are the project?
Prioritization of the project. So they don't have enough money. So like if I consider infrastructure is basically a network. So when they wanted to establish some resilient infrastructure, they need to come with like a lot of aspects. It's not only one sewerage retrofitting work. It's like the entire sewerage network along with the water system network and drainage network. So we need lots of money, and the poor, especially in the poor cities, they don't have that much money. They can do a holistic approach. They can come with an integrated approach and implement that. So ultimately, the problem starts with the decision-making framework. Like cities doesn't have a decision-making framework or decision-making process. That which one should we do first and which they should do
Right.
because they don't have money.
That's an excellent question. Go ahead. Sorry.
My second question is that why we are always this approach is coming in a silos, in the sense that when we're talking about sustainable infrastructure, so why sustainable infrastructure and sustainable materials are two different subjects? When we're talking about sustainable infrastructure, why sustainable materials are also integrated in the infrastructure?
Oh, absolutely. One person can only say so much in a short period of time. No one can cover everything. But that's why there's time for questions and discussion. So you're absolutely right about the second point. Let me make a more general comment. I think it's part of the materials that I sent across for you to read or to look at about not quite 10 years ago. I was asked to do a report on climate change adaptation in the built environment for the Premier of New South Wales, the governor of the whole state, the biggest state in terms of population in Australia. And so we did the report and presented it. Because the government then didn't believe in climate change, they just put it on the shelf. Why they paid us $50,000 for the report, I don't know, but I was happy to hire 4 doctoral students to do it. But in any case, what we found in our research for that report was that, and this was almost 10 years ago, that of all in advanced countries, OECD countries, of all the buildings that will exist in the year 2050, 75% of them, estimate, exist today. What does that mean? Retrofitting, which some people have already mentioned. So, yeah, there's continents like Africa or other countries that their populations and levels of consumption will grow, so there will need to be new cities and new places to live. Fair enough. Although most people are agglomerating onto existing cities and they're becoming mega cities. But in any case, retrofitting is critical, and what makes it so hard, because these systems are of the characteristics designed and planned and built under the principles of, let's call it the old school, the modernist or whatever, the rational, whatever you want to call it. And so we have to do it in a new way. And so, but when it's harder to retrofit some of these, so decisions have to be made. Do we just build a new system or network, or do we retrofit in these modular, incremental ways, small scale, et cetera, et cetera? And so, for example, in the United Kingdom, where I live now, I've been doing a lot of work on a larger scale infrastructure and trying to get some of this thinking across. And right now, the big decision, there's two big projects in the United Kingdom right now that directly relate to your question and the issues we've been talking about. One is what they call HS2, High Speed Rail 2, HS1 being the link from London to Paris and then to Brussels and Amsterdam. And HS2, High Speed Rail 2, will go from London north to Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, north of England. And when it was proposed, and they started doing some of the construction already, but just in London at one of the train stations, it's estimated to cost 57 or 58 billion pounds. Well, that now estimate has doubled. And the gain will be, between the furthest point, like Liverpool or Manchester and London, will be about 20 minutes faster. Right now, the rail between London, I took the train to Liverpool a couple of weeks ago to give a talk at another conference, and it was over 200 kilometers an hour, up to 220 kilometers an hour. So high-speed rail will save you 20 minutes at the furthest, Manchester and Liverpool. Is that worth 100? And if it's estimated 100 billion pounds, or 110 billion pounds now, and they just started construction, and the first link to Birmingham won't even be open for at least 10 years. Things are quite slow there. How much is it going to cost? Probably 200 billion. Is it worth it to save 20 minutes for a few people? What else does that money go to? The same could be said. I've done a lot of research in the last couple of years already in the UK on between Oxford and Cambridge, going through Milton Keynes, a new town from the late 60s, early 70s. There's in the greater Cambridge area, there's already over 1 million people. And there's about another 500,000 to 750,000 people west through Milton Keynes to Oxford. So they call it the East-West Arc, or the Oxford-Cambridge Corridor. And the government, through the National Infrastructure Commission that I'm working closely with, has proposed a rail line and an expressway, a motorway between the two, between Oxford and Cambridge, passing through Milton Keynes, to deal with, and it's really just a ruse, an excuse to develop hundreds of thousands of units of housing. They're projecting 1 million housing units in that area over the next decades. And but they're not considering any environmental or sustainability criteria, and they're not considering the real travel or economic patterns amongst those cities or towns. They're very dynamic, but most of their links are to London, and they don't consider the greater London region. And so these expressways and a railway combined would be in the tens of billions of pounds easily. And there's a real question of its sustainability, its cost effectiveness, etc. And so these are some live issues that address your question. And so a question is, do we mitigate or do we adapt? Do we retrofit or build new? Well, there's no single answer to that, but there are a number of valuable criteria that come from nature, from ecology, from resilience, adaptation, basic principles and criteria, then we could retrofit into our own thinking and our own planning and designing and make each of those decisions on a case-by-case basis depending on local knowledge, local needs, and local interests and local resources, right? We got to do what we can with what we have, but we have to change the thinking so we can do more or less depending with what we have. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, so another question on mine, like,
Well, let's give other people an opportunity if there's, and then we can come back. Yeah.
I thought your point about centralized infrastructure, making the individual implicit, was very interesting. I often feel stuck in my available options, and I was wondering what the options would look like in a modular infrastructure society. Or, like, does that mean more that the individuals decide how the infrastructure is created, or just that the options presented are less guilt-ridden?
Good question. I think that we have to redesign and retrofit virtually, not everything. I mean, there's been a lot of so-called disruption lately through apps and high tech, but technology is never the solution. It's usually the cause of the problem. I mean, you see that with social media and elections, not to mention violence, abuse, pornography, people around the list. But I think that the answer to your question is similar to the answer I just recently gave. We have to design what works in any particular place, but consider long-term futures. And that's a problem in big institutions and politics, because while corporations have long-term visions, which is why the oil companies are investing massive amounts of money, because they know, or they're betting, that the future will be carbon for at least 30 more years, right? The oil companies, when we look at their annual reports, we just look at their strategy documents, the ones that are public, meaning for public consumption to make them look as good as possible. They look to have their carbon intensity by 2050. Wow, that sounds just incredible. And so I think that it's up to us as creative people, and designers, designers across the board. I'm not just talking about engineering design or architectural design or urban design or infrastructure design. We have to redesign virtually everything. Redesign just simply means creatively rethink how we're going to live, and a lot of it's just going without or doing less, right? But still maintaining quality of life. Easy to say, or I'm not answering your question in any way that I'm sure you would like, but there's solutions. Some solutions are already out there, and you have aspects of the sharing economy, and some other aspects are causing a lot of problems in the cities. So, it's like a Janus face or a double-edged sword. Even starting with the image, be careful of what you ask for. Think about the longer-term consequences and about the interrelationship of those impacts, the cascading effects, and the cumulative effects over time. And scientific models aren't the only way to do that. Sometimes they're just games that you play. Literally, I use the word game not in a play sense, but in a scenario building. If we do this, if we design this, if we build this, what's going to happen? A lot of the times, even in New York, where you have the access to one of the wealthiest cities in the world, a lot of great knowledge and intelligence that you draw from the whole world, and they're just looking to build walls to keep the sea out. Oh, great. So it's up to you, all, us all, right? We have to be complicit in the solutions, not just business as usual.
also you told us that there must be an updating regarding the infrastructure and structure, right? Also, I read a newspaper which is called A New Urban Agenda by David Selwood, and he told that there are some big challenges regarding with how to get those kind of tools and ideas across the picture. So I was just wondering if you can tell us from your perspective, because it is well known that there are a lot of frameworks, international frameworks, that it says that we have to do a lot of things, but according to the paper, we have to go deeper, yeah? So my question is, from your perspective, how do we get sustainable infrastructure to the people, and not only just for the people, but also to big companies, in order to carry out successfully, and not to transmit the message regarding what there must be a thing.
Right. Well, that's a good question. As a planner and a designer, and my first degree actually was in chemical engineering, I found that, but most of my work since has been in ecology and in more natural systems. But we live in hybrid systems. We live in a human-dominated planet, I think, and human-dominated ecosystems. Human activities affect every ecosystem and every species on the planet. In fact, there's a famous issue of the journal Science, one of the leading scientific journals around, in 1997, with a very ominous photograph on the cover called, and all the articles where they very rarely do special issues, Science. And it was a special issue titled Human-Dominated Ecosystems in 1997, meaning the research had been done years before that. And so, why do I mention that? Because like any animal that adapts and evolves in its ecosystem or habitat, that evolutionary process takes time, and that's the intelligence of evolution. But we kind of supersede that with our own intelligence, which is often, we think it's well-intentioned, well-guided, but history has shown that, oops, we might have made a mistake here and there, despite all the so-called progress and all the, you're here from all over the world learning in a modern building with terrible light and terrible air quality and synthetic materials all around us that are off-gassing and, et cetera. So, there's some wooden coat hangers, sorry. And I think that we have, any solution has to be designed. All of design is looking at, let's call them solutions, to problems, let's call them, that are time and place specific. But part of that problem is that time and space specificity, given our rational thinking, is different than the intelligence of evolution, which doesn't have any rational intelligence at all. It just slowly, incrementally evolves. So what we have to do as designers, as I said earlier, think long term. Think of the interrelated impacts. Think of the cascading impacts. Is this going to dissipate into the environment in a non-toxic way? Is it going to be able to be absorbed or assimilated by the environment, or is it going to accumulate? And those kinds of things. So it's the principles that should guide you, I believe. I don't have any. I have lots of solutions, but I collaborate in all my projects and design solutions, let's call them, that are place and time specific, but also consider the future in ways that I just said. So there's no, matter of fact, you've heard of the silver bullet, right? The one, most consultants make their living, their money from, their silver bullet, their solution, kind of one size fits all. The problem is we often shoot ourselves in the foot with these silver bullets. There is no silver bullet, other than the one we shoot ourselves with. So that's why each solution has to be designed specifically. I can't give you a universal or a generic, I don't do that. Other some principles that come from nature.
May I
since it's just a quarter to 7, we will get all the questions and comments and get a final maybe comment since we need to close the session at 7.
Well, when I lecture at Oxford or Cambridge, we go out to the pub afterwards.
We can do that after 7.
Yes.
I just have more comments. If someone has a question, defer that question. So I too was thinking a lot about the way in which we as the people interacting in systems become complacent to the way in which they work, and that at the end of the day, we as people just need that infrastructure to work. But then also looking at the reflection where we really need to create opportunities for the people to become more resilient and adaptable and understand how the systems work and not just if they work or not. And for me, it really comes down to the way in which we as the people using the systems are interacting with those systems, and the connection that is being built in the process of daily interaction. And so that's everything from the aesthetic and the inclusion of public art and modality and accessibility, to the ways in which we can create our own sustainability and looking at smaller scale opportunities like tactical urbanism and some of those of the list of qualities that we put up there, things that are flexible and not expensive and all those meet all those qualities. But I think it's also interesting to think about, you brought up politics and the way in which we interact with the local system. And I mean, running for office is a great thing to do. It's also a very time-intensive thing to do. But it's even going to city council meetings or interacting with our politicians, and how accessible are those opportunities for us as people to voice our issues and our concerns with the infrastructure. Not everybody is able to go to a city council meeting and give a 3-minute public comment, or would even know what to say, because they just know what they feel. So,
I believe that council like this board is going to be listening on that.
right.
But I think that it's a point very well taken. I think that humans are extremely resilient, like any species. But related to your comment and thrust of my comments, infrastructures make us dependent on them. We're really dependent. And we're kind of addicted to these infrastructures, right? And it seems like the smaller, the more mobile, in fact, networked and distributed they are, right? Then we're becoming even more dependent. And so I think that itself decreases human resilience, that ability to act and react and to design and retrofit and redesign our own living circumstances. Because think of it this way, infrastructure and housing or structures, buildings, they're the only two things the economy that I know are completely supply driven. They're not demand driven. Most, we live in, as they call our societies, consumer societies, demand driven. But most markets, you learn, remember from economics 101, right? Supply and demand. Well, a lot of markets are demand driven,
coming to know part of the master degree. For the students who will have 2 more days with Michael to squeeze him. And for who is interested, we'll try also to deliver through our websites, www.masterurbanresilience.com, weekly post describing and disseminating a bit the results of our insights, brainstorming, etc., to get the message spread. So thanks for coming.